As you can see, I'm here to talk to you about Trump and neoliberalism. I assume that you all know a great deal about Trump, but neoliberalism might be relatively new or less familiar to you. Rather than getting bogged down in abstract definitions, I want to start with a concrete example to help center our thoughts about neoliberalism. This is something you might have heard about in the news. It's Amazon's decision to open a second headquarters, which has the catchy title of HQ2. And the process by which they're going to decide which city gets this headquarters is set up as almost a reality show style contest among the various cities which are submitting secret offers to Amazon with various incentives to try to lure the company to their town. Chicago's offer reportedly included $2 billion in incentives and offers Amazon the pick of any number of centrally located sites within the city. You might ask, why do cities choose to participate in something like this? Why engage in this kind of contest? And the answer, as with most things in politics, is jobs. But these are not very good jobs. Amazon is not actually a really nice place to work. Amazon warehouse workers report grueling conditions. They're constantly being monitored, constantly being pushed for more and more efficiency. And in fact, you may have heard that Amazon just patented a new wristband device which will allow them to track workers' movements in real time and try to eliminate even more inefficiencies. In exchange for living in this dystopian scenario, the workers get to enjoy low wages. A recent study in Ohio found that 700 of the workers in an Amazon warehouse were actually on food stamps. And this is after the state of Ohio had given Amazon $123 million in tax incentives to bring the warehouse to their state. Now, obviously, the headquarters is going to be an office, like a more of a corporate setting, but office workers at Amazon also report very bad conditions, that it's an incredibly competitive workplace, very anxiety-producing, basically making their lives miserable. So what this contest amounts to is that cities are actually competing to shovel money at the richest man in the world so that he can exploit their workers and make their lives miserable. Now let's imagine a different approach to this problem. Let's say the city says to Amazon, wow, it sounds like you need some workers. Well, we have workers. But what are you going to contribute to us? Sounds like there's going to be a lot more commuters downtown. Are you going to help us build the public transit necessary to support that? Are you going to give us the tax revenue to make the city a better place to live? Are you going to provide money for education so that the workers' children can have a bright future? And what about those working conditions? Is there anything we could do to kind of loosen things up a little bit? And then, if you're still with me in this fantasy, what if the federal government actually stepped in and told Amazon where to put their headquarters based on where it would do the most good? This scenario sounds almost laughable. It sounds impossible. In fact, any city that tried to do this would get laughed out of the room. No single city can change the situation. And from that perspective, I don't blame cities for choosing to participate in this somewhat humiliating process, although I do suspect that Chicago could get by without HQ2 and fervently hope that they do not actually get it. In any case, every city is forced to compete within the same competitive landscape, trying to draw companies and jobs to their area. For one city to have the opportunity to act differently, the whole world would have to be different. And I really do mean the whole world, because the same dynamics that I'm talking about happen at every level. On the global level, countries are constantly competing to try to draw investment and jobs. Within the US, states and cities are competing for investments and jobs all the time. The Amazon thing is just one very well-publicized example, but it's happening constantly. Within the city of Chicago, individual neighborhoods can even ask for permission to get special tax incentives to draw the all-important investment and jobs. And on the individual level, we are all constantly competing with each other. At school, at work, on social media, we're competing for jobs, for attention, for prestige. Basically, our entire world is structured as a competitive marketplace. Our reality really is a reality show. And as in a reality show, you never really win You just avoid getting voted out off of the island. But to make things worse, we're actually living in Hunger Games too, because once you've survived the process, you have to get thrown back into the competition again. You might think that once you get to become, a mega billionaire like Jeff Bezos, that you would opt out. But even he is constantly throwing himself back into these competitive situations as though he simply cannot imagine another life. This is what people are talking about when they talk about neoliberalism, this ethos of constant, nonstop competition on every level of life. And before we talk about why this particular term, neoliberalism, is used to describe this, I think it's important to emphasize the importance of simply having a name for it. For people who subscribe to neoliberalism, it's not some particular ideology, it's just the way the world works. It's just reality. Naming it says, no, this is a specific agenda, this is a specific ideology, it was a choice to implement it, and we can choose to change it as well. A different world is possible. Many of the people who are at the forefront of resisting neoliberalism are elders, such as Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, who lived at a time when the world really was different. What I characterized as the laughable, impossible relationship between government and business was actually a reality in the post-war era. Strong labor unions kept wages and working conditions good and improving, and broadly speaking, government policy was aimed more at supporting workers and consumers than at directly supporting business as such. A lot of economic analysts have called this regime Fordism, based on Henry Ford's insight that a business would be more profitable and stable if it paid workers enough that they could also afford to be the customers. Who's going to buy the cars if your workers can't afford them? This was a regime of mass production with high wages. It produced a broad middle class and a consumer society, and many people look back on this as kind of a golden age of capitalism. It'd be a mistake to idealize it too much because it was very much centered on the figure of the white family man as the ideal citizen, as the target of most of the support. It excluded people of other races, subordinated women, and people of non-traditional sexual orientations. But it did provide very real economic benefits that were gradually extending out to those excluded groups. So this is something that was doing people a lot of good, and that the people who were excluded from it wanted to get in on and were getting in on. This sounds like a good situation. Somewhat less fun, however, if you are a wealthy businessman. In that case, it seems unfair. You're paying very high taxes, you're not enjoying the kind of social prestige that you might think you deserve. So that's the conflict that's set up. Now, Fordism was developed in reaction to a 19th century model known as classical liberalism. And it's this model that is actually the basis for the liberalism part of neoliberalism. It has nothing to do with conservative versus liberal within conventional US political debates. This system was based on free markets, strong currencies, and frugal governments with balanced budgets. And for most of the 19th century, it produced peace and prosperity in Western countries, although the situation was less favorable if you were part of the colonized and enslaved population that provided much of the wealth. The system began to break down in World War I and was basically discredited in the Great Depression. And after the cataclysm of World War II, new systems emerged, of which Fordism was one prominent example. Despite the successes of Fordism, many critics wanted to return to a new version of the classical liberal model. And when Fordism started facing serious problems in the 1970s, they saw their chance to steer public policy in a different direction. So we have covered what the word liberalism means in neoliberalism, but what's neo? What's new about neoliberalism? The first thing is that the world situation has changed. Overt colonialism is no longer a thing, slavery has been abolished, and in place of that, developing nations kind of fill that economic role by providing low-wage labor and easily exploitable natural resources. Within Western countries, there are also, the situation has changed because there are now strong public institutions, most notably the welfare state. Now, you might suspect that these free market-oriented people would just want to destroy those institutions, get rid of them altogether. But what they do instead is redirect them towards neoliberal ends. This is most straightforward in the privatization of public functions, which turn public institutions into a site for private profit. In terms of welfare programs, the move is a little bit more subtle. They don't simply dismantle the program, but they reconfigure it so that it disciplines the poor and the poor population to constantly force them into work and by any means necessary. So broadly speaking, under neoliberalism, the role of the state is no longer to directly help workers and consumers, but to support the profitability of private firms. First of all, through lower taxes and less regulation. And all of this stuff kind of sounds Republican. It was actually broadly a bipartisan consensus for the last 40 years, essentially. Reagan, peeking around the corner, implemented many of the changes in the first wave, but later Democratic presidents like Clinton and Obama basically endorsed the system and tried to tweak it so that it would meet more progressive ends. I don't want to downplay the differences between Democrats and Republicans, which are very important and affect people's lives in very powerful ways. But on this very important question of how should we structure our society and our economy, they've been broadly in agreement. Now, obviously, since the financial crisis, this consensus has started to fall apart, and many people have started to view Donald Trump as potentially representing a break or a change from the neoliberal consensus. And some of the evidence that they marshal is that his key support came from regions screwed over by neoliberalism, most notably the Rust Belt, and to my eternal shame, my home state of Michigan. Many of his supporters are nostalgic for the Fordist era of greater prosperity and security. They're against free trade agreements like NAFTA, which have been the backbone of the global neoliberal order. And I think it's fair to say that Trump himself is likely not a neoliberal personally, simply because he is not a very sophisticated thinker, which I hope is not an insult. It seems like it's part of his appeal for many people. But when the rubber hits the road, though there have been significant differences in emphases, I don't think that there's been a paradigm shift. His biggest legislative achievement so far is a tax cut, which is just almost boring, frankly. The executive branch is very pro-corporate and anti-regulation. His publicity stunt in December of saving the jobs at the Indiana Carrier plant was just textbook neoliberalism, bribing the company so that they would not move those jobs. His infrastructure plan is similar in structure. It relies on tax incentives and other inducements that will hopefully inspire private businesses to build public infrastructure. Not sure how this is supposed to work. His idea, recently floated, to replace food stamps with actual boxes of food is just a neoliberal plan to further control and discipline the poor. On a more abstract level, he seems to view the presidency as a business opportunity, which takes privatization to a new level. And from my perspective, I think it's almost like a little too on the nose that he was literally a reality TV show host before he started running for office. I do think that there's something interesting going on with the ethos of grievance among Trump and his supporters. They are constantly talking about how America has been cheated. They're always worried about unfair advantages, especially for foreigners or for non-whites. And I think the hidden premise of these complaints is, we are awesome, so we should have won. Since we didn't win, or we didn't win in the way we thought we should, the game must have been rigged. The alternative to this conspiracy theory is that they are simply less successful competitors. And nothing keeps Trump up at night more than the thought of being a loser. So I would say that Trump and his supporters don't really reject the core ethos of endless competition that characterizes neoliberalism. They just want to make sure that the right kind of people start winning. So I would view Trump not as a break with neoliberalism, but as a weird kind of mutation or even a parody of neoliberalism. Now, in mainstream Democratic circles, there's been a lot of talk about how can we win back these Trump voters? How can we get them on the Democratic team? And I don't know, maybe that will work. Maybe it'll get more Democrats in office, but I don't think it's the basis for a real transformation of the neoliberal order. Basically, you cannot build a more just and equal society based on the support of people who just want the system to be rigged in their favor. So I think people who want to transform the neoliberal order need to look elsewhere. Thank you.